Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 13, the last of our lectures. So today we're going to be covering a topic that's pretty close to my heart, environmental ethics. And specifically, we're going to be covering the works of Peter Singer and Terrell Ward Bynum. But before we get into these readings, I just want to go over a few basic ideas. So remember our layout from the first lecture where I mentioned how there's sort of different levels of caring that you can be at. So basically we're going to be dealing a lot with this concept as we're going through our lecture today. And one of the central concepts that has to do with this is something that's known as moral extensionism. So, moral extensionism is the idea that moral history has progressed through a series of steps going from closer to the individual is the ego, and further out. Now, before I go any further, I want to not only explain that, moral extensionism, but I want to go over these in a little bit more detail again. So these are different centrisms that you can possibly have. So for example, if you're at ego, then you would be an egocentrist. If you were at anthropo, or people, you'd be an anthropocentrist, and so on and so forth for each of these. And what that basically means is, what are the things that you care about? What are the objects in the universe that you put into your moral calculations? So, like I said, ego is the self, so someone who's egocentric only takes themselves into their moral calculations of what they should and shouldn't do. A genocentrist is someone who only cares for their close, immediate biological family. A sociocentrist is someone who only cares for perhaps their tribe or their nation, their society. An anthropocentrist is someone who cares for people beyond their own society, but rather for all people, specifically humans. A sapiocentrist is someone who cares for all of the living things that can think to a certain degree, or in some cases feel to a certain degree. So if they're capable of suffering in some cases, or if they're capable of thinking in other cases, depending on which philosopher you're talking about, you would land in sapiocentrism. After that, we have something called biocentrism, which implies that everything that is alive, whether or not it meets some sort of requirement of, intellectual capacity, that in the biocentric case would still be taken into account. So all living things for the biocentrist have to be taken into account in your moral reasoning. A step beyond that, we have teleocentrism. Now, teleo comes from telos, or purpose, which we remember from Aristotle. So people who are teleocentrists believe that all and only things that have a purpose should be taken into account in your moral reasoning. And lastly, and now it's debatable whether ontocentrism and teleocentrism are quite the same thing, but there is ontocentrism, and that is just basically the flat-out acceptance that everything in the universe, all existing things, must be taken into account. So ontos has to do with existence. And you can imagine sort of different philosophers and people, or types of people along the spectrum. So as we mentioned right here at the end, we have the narcissists who stop their moral debating here at the egocentric line. Now, I drew it this way, but you got to keep in mind that these are actually circles all the way around. I don't have space to draw circles that big. So let's just keep that in mind while I say, so the narcissists end here at egocentrism. Someone like Hitler, who only cares for certain parts of his society, because obviously he was very cruel to other parts of his society. Someone like that would fall somewhere in the middle of the sociocentrism range. Someone who is just purely racist but doesn't necessarily care about nationality or something like that, they would fall into the somewhere in the middle of the anthropocentric category, because they like most humans, but not all humans. Now, I should also say it is in some ways arbitrary which way you organize these, because so as I was saying, here we have Hitler and here we have racism, but Hitler was straightforwardly a racist. So you could flip it around and say that Hitler's out here because he cares only about a certain race, independent of the nationality, whereas racism of a different kind cares only about nationality. The point is that this is more just like an expanding horizons. It's not meant to be like a absolute final description of how it looks like to expand your horizons. But this is certainly one way you can set it up. So with that said, let's move on to sapiocentrism, where we'll find Kant from our earlier readings. So he would count as somewhere in the middle of sapiocentrism, because while he doesn't accept all beings that have like suffering, beings that can actually want and either get those wants fulfilled or not, that would land around here. He thinks that only beings that are rational to a certain degree should be included. So for that reason, he's about in the middle. Then we have one of our authors for today. We have Singer. And Singer ends right at the end of the sapiocentrism boundary, because he draws his boundary in terms of whether or not a thing can suffer. If it can suffer, then you must take it into account. Moving on a little bit more, at biocentrism, we have someone named Paul Taylor, who was one of the very big figures in environmental ethics who argued for biocentrism. Moving on a little bit more, we have some other figures named Arrhenius and Aldo Leopold, and these were more kind of holistic thinkers within environmental ethics. So I put them here somewhere in the middle of Telio, but it's debatable exactly where you would put them. And then lastly, we have the ontocentrists, which would include Bynum, who is one of the people we're reading today, and one of the people that Bynum writes about in his essay, which is Luciano Floridi. And he's actually one of the very big figures in information ethics right now, but we'll talk a little bit more about him later. So all of these, it's a spectrum of something called moral considerability. And moral considerability just comes in on and off. It's either you have it or you don't. It means that I'm either taking you into account or I'm not. There's no half taking into account. It's either I take you into account or not. So moral considerability has to do with whether or not a certain thing should be taken into consideration when making moral decisions. But related to that is another concept called moral standing. Now, moral standing isn't an on or off thing. It's not a yes or no thing. It's something that comes in degrees. So moral standing has to do with how much weight or importance or value you assign to a thing when you take it into a consideration. So it's one thing to say that we should take into account all living things, but then it's a totally other thing to say which living things' interests should we privilege at the expense of other living things, because obviously, the circle of life, living things eat each other, typically speaking. And so for that reason, there is some degree of ordering and hierarchy that needs to come into it. So these are two concepts. We're mostly going to be focusing on this one as we go through, but eventually, later on, we'll get back to this one. So, a particular boogeyman in environmental ethics is this right here, anthropocentrism. This hard line in our moral reasoning seems to be one of the ones that, no matter what we do, there is still very heavy support for stopping right there. A lot of people and a lot of philosophers I'm not going to say most because I don't have the stats on that. It could be, a large group, but by no means a majority. In any case, a large group of people and philosophers believe that all and only humans should be morally considerable. Anything beyond that should only be taken into account insofar as it affects the interests of humans. And this sort of philosophy that draws the line right here has been a big thorn in the side of environmental ethics, because environmental ethics deals with things beyond the human sphere, things like plants and animals, and I should say animals and plants and streams, and just in some ways environmental ethics deals with everything. And so for that reason there's this real tension, this real hard line to cross right at the anthropocentric line. And the problem with it is that it's actually also a key tenet of a lot of the moral theories that we have today. It's not just standalone. So if you remember virtue ethics and deontology and utilitarianism, well, all three of these in some ways or another can be considered anthropocentric. Virtue ethics, it might contain some virtues that help promote the flourishing of some non-human things, but ultimately all of virtue ethics, or at least in Aristotle's form, has to do with making humans better and making humans flourish. So virtue ethics is anthropocentric. Well, what about deontology, Kant's thing? Well, deontology is all about rationality, and humans are rational, and pretty much nothing else is, at least to the degree we are. And so Kant, arguably, also is an anthropocentric thinker. He even went so far as to say that we have no actual duties to animals, but to be cruel to an animal would harden your heart and potentially make you be cruel to other people. So maybe you shouldn't be cruel to animals. But that's about as far as Kant goes with caring about anything beyond humans. Well, what about utilitarianism? Well, utilitarianism bases its judgments upon the existence of pleasure and pain. And so for that reason, to that degree, animals, they also have pleasure and pain to some degree, and so they can be included. But ultimately, it gives more weight, more moral standing to the human side of things, to the human pleasures and the things that only humans can enjoy. And so for that reason, even though utilitarianism technically could go beyond anthropocentrism, it's mostly just an anthropocentric theory. So with all that said, let's get to our first reading in this module. Peter Singer. Peter Singer, he was born in 1946, so I'm not going to bother to write it down. And the paper we're reading of his today is called All Animals Are Equal. So the first thing that Peter Singer does is draw our attention to the civil rights movements that have happened in the past 100 years or so, such as the Black Liberation Movement and the Women's Rights Movement. Although he doesn't want to limit he doesn't want it to limit it to this, and cautions against declaring victory against some sort of final last remaining form of discrimination, because he says that history has shown that there always seems to be more types of discrimination that have been left unnoticed until then. Singer then makes an appeal to the concept of moral extensionism, which I talked about earlier. He wants to make an argument for why we should extend our moral consideration from beyond this line to about here, to all things that can feel, which certainly includes animals. But more specifically, he wants to extend the principle of equality to other species. So that's kind of how he wants to put it in terms of species. So Singer then goes on to describe a strategy that opponents of the civil rights movement, such as the Black Liberation Movement or the Women's Rights Movement, have done in the past. And this strategy is known as a reductio ad absurdum. And a reductio ad absurdum is basically trying to use the arguments of your opponent to conclude something silly. So the opponents of the women's rights movement specifically argued that if we give women rights, then on the basis of giving women those rights, we would also have to give rights to things such as brutes. Well, what they mean by brutes is kind of like animals. And because giving rights to animals is absurd, says these people back back in the day, then giving rights to women would also be absurd. So Singer is pointing out how even then people were noticing this connection between the concept of equality and extension of it to things beyond the human realm. Thus, their argument was that you could either give rights to both women and brutes, or you just don't give rights to women at all. At that point in history, this was dismissed mostly as just satire. But Singer wants to take it seriously. Singer wants to argue that the extension for the equality of equality to animals is right, that we need to extend our moral consideration to things that people back then might call brutes. But not all things can enjoy all rights. So animals cannot vote because they don't have the reasoning capacity to understand even what that means. And men can't have abortions. So there are certain things that because of what you are, we don't need to give you a right for that thing. So there's no reason to give men a right to an abortion. So what this means is that whatever the principle of equality is, it doesn't require absolute equal treatment. So there's a difference there. But then what does equality mean? It's clear that it can't mean that all the relevant subjects are literally equal, as people and animals come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. So equality can't mean literal equality. It can't just be a society of me running around. It has to be, it's not that it has to be, it just is lots of difference going on. So the demand for equality might be justified on the basis of some sort of actual equality beyond the apparent differences. Like, for example, you cannot, only knowing that a person is black, or let's say knowing that a person is a female, infer anything else about that person. All you know, knowing that they are black, is that they are black. There's no other information you can get from that. Because there's no required connection between between being black or a woman and being a certain way that is morally relevant. And so for that reason, things like racism is bad, because to make that distinction is basically just to attach moral judgments onto something that itself doesn't have any connection to that. But these arguments don't work against a sophisticated opponent of equality, says Singer. If we imagine some perfect system of talking about differences that's like, I don't know, perfectly scientific or made by someone or something like that, that would rank people from 1 to 100 and then give them rights accordingly, that would also be a bad situation. It wouldn't be any better than, having rights be based on sex or race. So we should not base the principle of equality on some actual equality, as there can be differences found not only in individuals, but also across groups when you look at them statistically. So if you look at two groups on some sort of metric, you'll often get something like this, where you'll have two bell curves basically overlapping each other. And you'll only find some very minor statistical differences here and there that you can actually make some points about. But, and this is the key point, these sorts of differences are only seen on the statistical level looking above. When you're looking at an individual, these totally break down, because there's no way to tell which individual you're looking at. So the individual you're looking at might be over here and be higher on whatever metric it is than all the other individuals from the other category, whereas you might expect the opposite according to the the stereotype or the bad interpretation of statistics. And another problem here is that even if there are these differences between people or between groups, it's not clear whether these differences are due to nature or to nurture, or in other words, if they're due to your biology or due to your education and your environment. And for that reason, it's not clear that anything we're talking about here is actually intrinsic to the group. It's actually a truth. Ultimately, he wants to say that basing our judgments on actual facts of equality between people, between the properties of people, leaves open the possibility that some real difference might be found between people, but it's unacceptable to let such a difference get in the way of the principle of equality. Or in other words, to let us treat those people who are different any worse just because it's been found scientifically that they're different in some way or other. Equality should not depend on intelligence. It should not depend on moral capacity. It should not depend on strength or any other such a thing. The principle of equality isn't a description of the world, but rather it's a prescription. So there's this difference between, let's see here. So we have description, and we have prescription. So a description of the world is just saying how the world is, and he's saying that the principle of equality isn't trying to tell us how the world actually is, rather it's trying to prescribe how the world should be. So if a description is how the world is, then prescription is how the world ought to be. So that's just an important little distinction because it allows us to understand what he's saying here about the principle of equality. That's something that we want for the world, even if it's not in the world as such. So, according to Singer, speciesism, and that's going to be a key word here, speciesism, ought to be condemned on the same grounds as racism or sexism, because it's drawing one of these arbitrary lines that don't actually have any real rational basis to them. If degrees of intelligence don't matter in humans when we're judging whether or not we should consider them morally, then why should it matter when in the case of animals or other living things? And he draws on the case here of a mentally disabled person. So he is giving an example how in some cases a very severely mentally disabled person might have lower cognitive abilities than a very smart animal like a dolphin or something like that. And for that reason, it seems unclear why we could ever base our feelings of moral considerability on intelligence, because it's clear that we still want to say that people who are severely mentally disabled are nevertheless morally considerable. He says that some utilitarians saw that the principle of equality extends in this way, and he gives a pretty famous quote of Bentham's to back this up. Bentham, who is one of the forefathers of the theory called utilitarianism, which we've mentioned a little bit in this lecture series, he says that the question is not can they reason, nor is it can they talk, but rather the question is can they suffer. So that is what's important when you're judging whether something is morally considerable. You have to know whether something can suffer, or at least according to Singer. The capacity to suffer is just what makes something worthy of moral consideration, by definition. The capacity to suffer is required for the capacity to have interests. And ethics is about respecting and satisfying interests. Thus, if something can't suffer, it can't have interests, and thus it can't be a subject of moral concern. An example for this that I learned in undergrad, but at this point I've forgotten the reference to it, but it was something along the lines of the hard-headed turtle people. So if there was, imagine this world where all the people in that world were very well armored with turtle plates or something like that. So to the point of practically being indestructible. There's nothing you could violently do to them to hurt them. And the idea is that in such a world where there's no way to actually hurt someone, there would be no laws about violence, for example. Singer uses a different example. He uses the example of the stone being kicked down the road by a child. He says, what interest does the stone have in not being kicked down the road? A stone can't be hurt, and for that reason it needn't be morally considered. But something like a mouse can be hurt, so it must be morally considered. This is debatable, however, as we'll find in the next reading that we're going to cover. But in any case, Singer considers himself a sentientist. So he draws himself over here, and he calls himself a sentientist, which means that he wants to say that all and only things that are sentient ought to be morally considerable. And in the terms that I outlined earlier, he would roughly count as a sapiocentrist. So Singer goes on to say that most humans are speciesist. Any ism in this context is understood as the subordination of an outgroup's interests to the interests of the in-group, and specifically the in-group in question. So a speciesist is someone who subordinates species that are not the same as yours to your own species. Basically, how should I put this? They're paying the cost and you're getting the food kind of situation. You're using things outside of your group for your own benefit because you don't care about those things. And that's the kind of ism that is operating here. So, Singer subordinates the non-sentient, everything over here, to the sentient, whereas the anthropocentrists subordinate everything beyond this line to everything on this side of the line. Now, one major argument that Singer wants to make here is that meat eating and the meat industry are not very ethical for the reasons that he's outlining here. He argues that most people accept huge amounts of suffering in animals just for the sake of taste and only taste. And this is an important point that he has to make because it's not as though there's some necessity to it. It's just a pleasure that people continue eating meat for. He argues that science has shown that we can replace our diets with a purely vegetarian diet. This is mostly true, although there are some vitamins like B12 and D3, which can only really feasibly be gotten from animals. But this is besides the point, and technology is advancing every day, so don't quote me on this. In any case, he says animals are treated like machines to turn fodder into flesh, and any innovation that is liable to result in a higher conversion ratio of fodder to flesh is likely to be adopted. Here he is referencing things like the battery farm technology, where if you're able to cram more animals in a smaller space and therefore get more money out of it, then you do it. He further remarks on the quote, cruelty is acknowledged only when profitability ceases. So, for example, pigs are as smart as dogs. But we accept the suffering of pigs because it is profitable, whereas causing suffering for dogs is not profitable. People will only pay for the suffering of pigs. The issue he sees here at its core is that by supporting mass-produced meat industry, we are sacrificing the most important interests of animals for the sake of satisfying our trivial interests, which again is just because we like the taste of it, says Singer. So stopping the eating of meat is difficult, but there's no way it could be more difficult than it was to go against slavery and free one's slaves. This also applies to the issue of experimentation on animals. So he gives a few examples of clearly cruel experiments. So there's one called LD40. Now, LD stands for lethal dose, and in this experiment, they would just take something like, let's say, the ink from this marker, and they would just force feed it to, I don't know, rabbits or something. And they would just keep on filling up these rabbits with pen ink until half of the rabbits in the test study died. And at that point, they say, okay, well, this is the lethal dose. But perhaps this could be argued to have some purpose, because after all, how would we test what a lethal dose is for us, if not by some method that doesn't actually require a lethal dose in a human? But Singer goes on to give another example of an experiment that has clearly very little use. So this was the dog electrocution experiment, where they electrocuted dogs, and the dogs had to press a button to stop the electrocution, and they saw how fast the dogs would learn about that, and basically it was just hours and hours and hours of dogs getting electrocuted for basically no real discoveries that could help anyone. So in this case, it's clear that the gains are minimal, whereas the costs in terms of suffering are very great. So the test case that Singer gives is, would you be willing to perform this experiment on an orphaned human infant? If not, then you're being arbitrary and inconsistent by allowing such experiments to happen on non-humans. Some might argue that children are special because they will eventually become humans. But, says Singer, this is ignoring the cases where there are people and children who are, as he says, permanently mentally disabled. So there's no point in their life, foreseeably, that they're ever going to become a full-fledged rational human. They're always going to have a severe mental disability. And so, therefore, this argument that children will eventually become humans or full humans doesn't work, because these people, whether they're children or adults, will never become full humans. And so Singer could change the thing. Would you be willing to perform this experiment on a mentally disabled person? It's the same sort of tension that's going on. Now, Singer wants to point out that speciesism, this line here, is pretty common in philosophy, and I've talked a little bit about that already. So philosophers at that time seemed to want to make the same speciesist assumptions as common people. All discussions about equality, for example, were always phrased in terms of human equality. Many of these philosophers avoid biting the bullet or taking the bitter pill of animal rights by using what Singer calls devious arguments. Now, biting the bullet and taking the bitter pill, it just basically means accepting a conclusion that you don't want to accept, but are nevertheless driven to because of a process of reasoning. So Singer says that certain people were using devious arguments to avoid accepting this unfavorable conclusion. For example, they might say that humans can enjoy themselves in a ways that animals can't. But when pressed, these same people will admit that the real kind of happiness that's being aimed here is not some sort of moral happiness like the Aristotelian life of philosophy kind of happiness, but rather just happiness and pleasure, that kind of happiness. But, says Singer, if it isn't about the moral life, then deep thought isn't required, and so animals could also presumably have a good life. So Singer wants to criticize lofty theories like Kant's over here, because they appeal to very bad and vague concepts like in the intrinsic dignity of humans, or the intrinsic value of humans, or, as Kant puts it, treating humans as ends in themselves. There's always this assumption here that humans are the best, that Singer thinks is ultimately unsupported speciesism. Philosophers in older times at least justified the special status of humans by appealing to something like divine favor or something like that. And humans were chosen or created by gods, and so they must be better. But in modern times and contemporary times, philosophers, at least the ones that Singer was reading back then, seem to not even require an explanation that far. They just take it for granted that humans are morally important and more important than other things. They don't even go so far as to justify it by appealing to some sort of god or something. And so he says that humanism, which is kind of another word for anthropocentrism here, it's the idea that only humans are valuable, sounds good to most people, but humans are just a small part of the overall Earth. So in conclusion, Singer sums up his argument this way. If we accept that there are permanently mentally disabled people, and making moral distinctions based on race, sex, or IQ is unacceptable, then making distinctions based on a species' ability to reason is not acceptable either. Singer wanted to take the anthropocentric position of most ethics and drag it further up the chain of caring. The result was a philosophy that, today, has inspired many vegetarians and vegans to engage in their practice because they were convinced that it was morally wrong to eat meat. This isn't the end of the story, though, as might be implied by the chain of caring that goes beyond Singer. So Singer has now pushed the position to here. Well, Taylor pushes it a little bit further later on, but for now, let's just say that we're here. What about all this other stuff in this area here? There's clearly some more work to be done. Our next reading, by Terrell Ward Bynum, is a summary of the most recent history of a new ethical theory that he calls flourishing ethics. He says that it can be divided into two categories. There is human-centered, flourishing ethics, and then there is general flourishing ethics. So these are the two distinctions he wants to make, and we'll go a little bit more into them later. And this theory, as we will get into, is kind of like a combination between the philosophy of information and ethical philosophy. Bynum does this by leading us through and appealing to a few different philosophers. We have Thomas Kuhn, Aristotle, Norbert Wiener, James Moore, and Luciano Floridi. First, he begins the essay with Kuhn. So Thomas Kuhn was famous for, among other things, developing the idea of scientific paradigms and scientific revolutions. So let me get that on the board here. Scientific paradigms. So, and you'll be able to find this written out in my notes. Science, according to Kuhn, proceeds in a particular way throughout history. So first, a particular philosopher or scientist thinks of a new way to do things that solves old problems. Next, step 2, others adopt that philosophy and its assumptions and answer many questions based on that. Step 3, counterexamples and test cases start cropping up that start threatening the assumptions of that philosophy. Bynum refers to these as anomalies, and so does Kuhn in his writing. And these anomalies build up and sort of kind of like a pressure cooker start causing problems for the theory itself. And thus, step 4, a crisis occurs, where faith in the established philosophy kind of fails and falters. And finally, step 5, it's the same as step 1. A particular philosopher thinks of a new way of doing things and solves, or at least explains, why there were the anomalies before. Now, Kuhn originally applied this to science. For example, Aristotelian science was replaced by Newtonian science, which was then replaced by Einsteinian science. Or, in case of the astronomy, we have the Ptolemaic model of the solar system being replaced by the Copernican model of the solar system, which again then was replaced by the relativistic theory of the universe, which kind of doesn't have a center. What revolutionary science is then is something which removes the old anomalies, decreases complexity, and increases usability. It's kind of something that addresses the problems that have cropped up, the pressure cooker, and resolves them. And because it resolves them in a certain way, it's adopted by people. Now, the reason that people adopt these, because they're more usable and less complex and so forth, these are known as theoretical virtues, and are an indirect way of deciding between competing scientific or other theories. You can learn more about this sort of thing if you take something like a philosophy of science class. In any case, ethics, like science, can also behave according to Kuhn's model, says Bynum. Indeed, the belief that ethics can be revolutionized has produced many great ethical theories. But now a new ethical theory is brewing, and its origins are found in the field of computer science, at least according to Bynum. Now, this theory, it arose from computer ethics, has deep Aristotelian roots, has some similarities to Taoism and Buddhism, is strongly supported by modern science's view of the world, and lastly is called flourishing ethics. Oh, I guess I haven't written it up yet, but flourishing ethics. And as mentioned earlier, he divides this into two categories, human-centered and general. The first, as the name implies, is only interested in the flourishing of humans, whereas the second is interested in the flourishing of all things. It is general. This theory, says Bynum, resolves three anomalies that have been building up in traditional ethics. So, let's get this on the board. We have three anomalies. Number one is the belief that there should be only one true ethical theory. So, rejection of all theories but one. So this is, he's kind of commenting on the phenomena that people only choosing one ethical theory to stick to. So if you're a utilitarian, then you're not a deontologist. If you're a deontologist, then you're not a utilitarian. You can't pick both. And this, in many cases, has caused problems in ethics. The second anomaly that Bynum wants to outline is troublesome cases. So this is kind of like the just test cases that I mentioned earlier that cause problems. When you say, okay, well, here's this theory, how does it deal with this? Well, in that case, if it gives a bad answer, then it creates a troublesome test case. So let's just call this troublesome cases. And lastly, we have difficulty accounting for non-humans. Now, in his essay, Bynum wants to say that this theory, flourishing ethics, can resolve these anomalies that have been plaguing traditional ethics. And in order to do this, he first wants to say a little bit about his methodology. He's using an appeal to something called Occam's razor, which is a principle of reasoning that says that, generally speaking, the simplest explanation is the best explanation. You shouldn't multiply the entities posited in your explanation beyond necessity. So, for example, if we're able to explain electricity just by positing electrons moving around in a wire, then we don't need to add something extra like, oh, and those electrons are being dragged about by some tiny little fairies. We can leave the fairies out because they're not needed for the explanation. So, in other words, Bynum wants to keep it very simple and assume as few things as possible. And what does he want to assume? Well, he wants to only assume what is told to us by modern science. So, roughly speaking, he only wants to assume the picture of the world presented to us by our scientific findings. So, with that out of the way, Bynum starts with dealing with human-centered flourishing ethics and the people that fall under that. The first example of this position that he gives is Aristotle. So we covered Aristotle, and we can perhaps already know a little bit, or guess a little bit, as to why he counts as a human-centered flourishing ethics. Aristotle used his knowledge of science to construct his ethics. So his theory of animal behavior, combined with his theory of reasoning, produced his theories of human purpose, action, and virtue. Thus, Aristotle can be considered an early form of human-centered flourishing ethics. Modern flourishing ethics also makes heavy use of scientific knowledge, such as astrophysics, genetics, neurobiology, and computer science. Flourishing ethics is also compatible across cultures, just as Aristotle's theory of virtue was. Different cultures can all agree that a virtue such as compassion is a good one. But despite that, flourishing ethics is not relativistic or highly permissible. Even though flourishing ethics can appeal to different cultures, it's not saying that there is no right answer. Now, Aristotle's account of human purpose, according to Bynum, is that the purpose of human life is to flourish as a human being by doing what humans are especially equipped to do excellently. Now, humans are equipped for reason, and so that is what they must excel in. There are Bynum wants to say that there are similarities between Aristotle's view and someone he'll cover a little bit later, Norbert Wiener. Now, Wiener was a mid-20th century thinker known as the father of cybernetics. He also had certain ethical views that later became known as information ethics, but he didn't call it that when he was alive. In any case, we'll cover more of that when we get to him. So Aristotle's theory distinguishes animals from plants by their abilities to perceive, to process, and to react to information, or their environment. This has to do with Aristotle's idea, which we did not cover in detail, of the different kinds of souls. So to Aristotle, there are basically three kinds of soul. So the first kind of soul, which is the most basic kind of soul that every living thing has, is called a vegetative soul. So vegetative soul is something that even plants have, and it's something that just basically is able to take in nutrients and maintain itself in some level of homeostasis. The next level of soul, according to Aristotle, is the animal soul. And the animal soul, as we just mentioned, is something that goes beyond the vegetative soul. The animal soul is able to perceive its environment, to make decisions, and to actually go out there and find its food, to move around. Lastly, we have the rational soul, which, as you might guess, is something that only humans possess. The kind of thing something is, therefore, determines how it perceives and processes and reacts to its environment. Aristotle thought that the most advanced form of information processing in the animal kingdom could be found in humans. And these functions in humans of practical and theoretical reasoning produced meaning in the world. This meaning is drawn from the information in the world, but how to properly define information is an ongoing problem that philosophy is still tackling. Autonomy, like information processing, is also key to human flourishing, but it's not sufficient. Humans also need to be social in order to flourish, because they need a society to help them flourish. Humans need to be able to share information, create information, and collaborate on information. There are thus many ways for humans to flourish, given that these above conditions have been met. They can be a philosopher, or a diplomat, or a teacher, or a farmer, or a builder, or a midwife, or so on. They can be many different things and be satisfied or fulfilled doing those things. Or in other words, they can flourish doing those things. So to conclude this section, Wiener gives us 5 main points about Aristotle's philosophy that he wants to draw out for his purposes. First is that human flourishing is central. Next is that humans are social animals and require society to flourish. Next is that the nature of a thing is determined by what that thing is equipped to do, and to flourish, it must do that thing excellently and continuously. Fourthly, to acquire general knowledge through theoretical reasoning, and to act autonomously via practical reasoning, is what it means for a human to flourish. So for a human to flourish, they must reason both practically and theoretically. And fifthly, the key to being ethical is choosing wise goals, planning wise steps to achieve those goals, and actually taking those steps, as we covered when we were talking about Aristotle a few lectures ago. All of these things, though, require information processing ability. With that said, Bynum goes on to describe Norbert Wiener's philosophy, who we covered earlier. So let's make a little bit of room here. So now we have Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener was the inventor of cybernetics and established key components of modern computer science. He was also a philosopher and predicted many of the ethical issues that technology would create in the future. He is credited with creating the field of information ethics, although, as I said, he didn't call it that himself. So, at this point, after giving a little bit of blurb about Wiener, Bynum starts by giving us some more detail about Bynum's metaphysics. His metaphysics gives an account of human nature and society, and includes views about how information is tied into that. First off, we should define what cybernetics means. So according to Bynum, cybernetics is the science of information feedback systems and the statistical study of communication. Wiener viewed all humans and animals as cybernetic systems, as loops of information that maintain themselves. Wiener was informed not just by his computer science knowledge, however, but also by a knowledge of relativity, of thermodynamics, of statistical mechanics, and of Darwinian biology. Both Aristotle and Wiener saw the essence of animality to be taking place in information gathering, processing, and acting upon. They both saw a connection between human nature as information processing and human purpose itself. For Wiener, to flourish as a person is the purpose of life, and this includes engaging in as diverse a set of information processing activities as possible. Wiener says information is a name for the content exchanged between the outer world and ourselves, paraphrasing. And to live effectively is to live with adequate information. So these are things that Wiener said. Ants and humans differ in their informational needs to the degree that they differ in their mental versatility. Not only can animals and humans be seen as cybernetic entities, but also communities, societies, and ecosystems as well.
These things count as second-level cybernetic systems because they are cybernetic systems whose parts are also cybernetic systems. Now, in case it wasn't clear, I just want to say this one more time. What is a cybernetic system? A cybernetic system is a set of information which, you know, just like our brain passes information to itself and processes it recursively affects itself, and it's able to kind of keep itself going through time. So that's just what a cybernetic system is. It's something that takes in information, it processes it, and then it acts accordingly so that that process can continue to exist. Now, for Wiener, as I was just mentioning, the second level cybernetic systems like societies and ecosystems, for Wiener, in such things, the very cement of them is communication and the passing of information. Now, Bynum now goes on to describe Wiener's ethical views. So Wiener did not explicitly call it machine ethics or cyber ethics, or provide details of what such an ethics would be like, but he did express the need for such things. He focused on the actions and values of human beings ultimately, and therefore his stance still counts as a human-centered, flourishing ethics. But his metaphysics provide a sufficient foundation for a more general, flourishing ethics. In any case, Wiener thought that a good human life is one where their information processing capacity is used to its full potential. One where the person fully realizes a full variety of possible autonomous actions. It was therefore also possible in Wiener's mind for different ways to exist that might achieve this, given the wide variety of possible autonomous activities. And this brings us back to the idea that there's different ways to flourish. Now, in terms of politics, Wiener believed that society should be built on principles that maximize flourishing within that society. And it maximizes a person's ability to flourish through a variety and flexibility of human action. And the principles that he gives are these. The first one is the principle of freedom. And this principle has it that this principle is where people have the liberty to develop their full measure of human potential. The next principle is the principle of equality, and the principle of equality has it that when something is just for A and B, then it must also be just should A and B switch places. So, for example, if it is just for me to steal from you, then it must be also just for you to steal from me. Now, obviously, neither of those things are just, but you get the idea. The third principle is the principle of benevolence. That's where there is goodwill between people as much as possible in that society. And lastly, and this is kind of like an extra principle, the principle of minimum infringement on freedom. So this is where only infringements on freedom that are absolutely required for the proper functioning of society are allowed. Anything that isn't a required infringement on freedom isn't allowed. So for Wiener, a good society is one which upholds these principles, and thus not only doesn't limit the citizens' ability to flourish, but also promotes their ability to flourish so they can flourish even more than they would be able to on their own. In short, a society is good to the degree that it promotes flourishing of its citizens. Bynum says if we accept Wiener's account of human nature and the good of society, then many different cultures and customs might be considered good insofar as they promote flourishing. This stands as a counter-argument to ethical relativism, which concludes from the fact that cultures are different that there is no such thing as right and wrong, that you can't judge other cultures. But instead, Wiener's position is that you can nevertheless judge cultures, but it's according to this universal metric that they all agree to, which is flourishing. Now, given this account of Wiener's views, Bynum now briefly turns to James Moore's philosophy. Now, Moore independently developed his own form of computer ethics. He saw that there were policy vacuums created by new technology that had to be filled. And specifically, these policy vacuums had to be filled by just policies. These policies had to apply to everyone equally, as just like it would happen in impartial justice in a court. These policies had to be evaluated and compared based on potential consequences for autonomy. And lastly, these policies or policymakers must consider the good of others when making these policies. Thus, Moore's view, with his focus on autonomy, sociality, and justice, would also count as a human-centered, flourishing ethics. Thus, Bynum now returns to the anomalies, which he mentioned before, and argues that the first two can be resolved by human-centered, flourishing ethics, like those of Aristotle, Wiener, or Moore. He says, for the first one, that human-centered flourishing ethic provides a foundation compatible with many different traditions and practices, as I just mentioned. It is consistent with different moral traditions. It satisfies the Kantian focus on respecting people, but it also satisfies the utilitarian focus on happiness and pleasure, because that's part of flourishing. And so it has this kind of like ability to not only cross cultures, but cross theories. So, because of that, just this specific kind of flourishing ethics by itself is able to get rid of the first anomaly. Well, what about the second anomaly? Well, because it got rid of the first anomaly, it's now able to make use of different tools. And so for that reason, because it lacks dogmatism, human-centered flourishing ethics can quickly resolve cases by appealing to different frameworks depending on which framework would be best to apply in that particular situation. So if you need to be a utilitarian in a particular situation, you can use utilitarian ethics. If you need to be a Kantian in a particular situation, you can use Kantian principles. That's perfectly fine, so long as it all promotes flourishing. So because of that, by itself, human-centered flourishing ethics is able to get rid of anomalies 1 and 2. But it's not able to get rid of anomaly 3, accounting for non-humans, because by definition, human-centered flourishing ethics is only centered on humans, so it can't deal with non-humans. Now, personally, I find Bynum's resolution of the second anomaly to be a little bit fast and loose, a little bit wishy-washy. It seems to me that only general flourishing ethics can probably properly solve the problem of tricky cases by introducing a universal metric of value, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself at this point. Now, Bynum, at this point, discusses the limitations of human-centered flourishing ethics. He says that focusing on humans is insufficient. He puts it both mildly and harshly. In the mild way, he says that it violates common sense to some, to say that the welfare of non-humans is just not important. That's just not intuitive to a lot of people. And now the more harsh way to put it is that human-centered flourishing ethics counts as speciesism. Now we remember speciesism from Singer. That's the same sort of concept. And because it counts as speciesism, well, not because of it, but moreover, ethics must include all living things, perhaps even all of nature, even the non-living stuff. To not do that would be speciesism. But, says Bynum, human-centered flourishing ethics is actually just one part of general flourishing ethics. And so for that reason, we ought to look to general flourishing ethics to see if it can resolve this problem. Now, he says that Norbert Wiener believed that machines would join humans in collecting, processing, and acting upon information, as well as communicating. Communication, as we noted earlier, was, in Wiener's view, the very cement of society. Wiener also predicted things like the rise of cybernetic machines with limbs, or in other words, robots, that would replace human jobs. He also predicted the development of cybernetic implants that interface with human brains, whether they be prosthetics or otherwise. In short, then, Wiener foresaw a society where cyborgs and information processing machines would make up a key part of what is normal in our day-to-day lives in society. Cyborg itself is a shorthand way of saying cyber organism. Or, in other words, living things merged with machines in one way or another. Wiener did caution, however, against creating machines that we couldn't control, or against delegating our moral decision-making to a machine. Even if we decide to let a machine choose for us, the moral weight is still on our shoulders for accepting the decision that the machine makes and acting according to it. We can't get rid of our responsibility by giving it to a machine. So, because of these worries, Wiener thought that we need to have rules for artificial agents. He thought that questions like, does it have a mind, is it conscious, will it be alive, are meaningless semantic quibbles in a way kind of similar to the way Hume thought that certain questions were meaningless. That being said, he did think questions about the intellectual capacities of machines were fair so long as they were phrased right. But in order to talk about such questions, Bynum first wants to establish in more detail what Wiener's metaphysics was relative to his information ethics. So, to Wiener, information is physical. Information is subject to the laws of nature. It is measurable by science. And the way it's measurable is as something known as Shannon information. Now, Shannon information is basically a measure of the surprise content of a message. So, for example, if the only possible message I could have sent you was a 1 or a 0, then the surprise content of any single 1 or 0 that I send you is about 50%, because there's about 50% chance, all things being equal, that you get a 1 or a 0 if it was random. And lastly, Wiener wants to say that information is neither matter nor energy. It's some sort of third thing that isn't either one of those things. Wiener thought that matter and energy could not exist without information, but also that information could not exist without matter and energy. Living organisms, in his view, are persistent patterns of information in an ever-flowing flux of matter. So to explain that a little bit more, I'm perhaps a pattern, but the cells that compose me, I'm sure you've heard this before, we change all of our cells every 7 years or something like that. The point is, we're not the same stuff anymore, and yet we're the same thing. And the reason for that is because we're the same flow, the same process of information holding itself together. And this is particularly useful in the philosophy of mind for the identity problem of what makes me the same me that I was yesterday. Well, in this case, it's because I count as an informational object, and that's the thing that is constant across time. It's not the stuff that makes me up. And Bynum wants to say this is very similar to Aristotle's concept of matter and form, or perhaps the Taoists' concept of yin and yang, or perhaps the Hindu concept of Shiva's cosmic dance of creation and destruction. So, to Wiener, information is not the same thing as meaning, because meaning is meaning for someone, whereas Shannon information can just be in stuff. And it can be that way without actually meaning something to someone. Now, how exactly one should translate pure information into meaning is another huge problem that philosophy is still working on. So, if you want to write a dissertation for a PhD, that would be a great topic. But in any case, neither I nor Bynum want to get too deep into that question right now. Now, at this point, Bynum switches gear to point out the ways in which Wiener's theory draws on modern science. The universe, according to contemporary physics, is fundamentally informational and statistical. When you look at the quantum level, there's something very statistical going on. Every object in the universe, according to science, is actually no more than a particular persisting pattern of relationships describable as information. Thus, Wiener's view, says Bynum, is increasingly being supported by modern science. Continuing on the theme of drawing on science, but shifting gears again a little bit, Bynum focuses on Wiener's understanding of good and evil. Wiener's main understanding of evil isn't just that it's evil people, or there's a evil devil out there somewhere that's literally just a person. Rather, it's a kind of natural evil built into the very fabric of reality. And the name for this natural evil is entropy. Dun, dun, dun. So he sees entropy as the main evil, even going so far as to call it the devil. It's an arch enemy of all order and structure in the universe. Since entropy is the enemy of all things, then it must be good to resist entropy. Entropy makes its famous appearance in the second law of thermodynamics, and that law states that within a closed system, the order must decrease to zero. So, or in other words, that within a closed system, entropy will always increase to the maximum. Entropy was originally understood as lost heat. When they were designing engines, they wouldn't. Some of the energy from the gas or the fuel would, instead of going into turning the engines, it would go and just heat up the engine and float off into the space, and it wouldn't do any useful work. So that's kind of how that concept got started, but it then got transferred into the concept of lost energy, but now is more generally understood as the concept of lost usable energy or usable information. Now, when entropy increases, order decreases by definition. The way this happens is that by not having as much energy available, a system is no longer able to maintain its order and structures, its Shannon information. Science tells us that the fate of all things in the universe tend towards a final cold state known as the heat death of the universe, where everything is so cold and spread out that basically nothing happens anymore, and it's just like a dead chaos. But biological and especially intelligent life is capable of creating and protecting information by flourishing. This still takes energy from elsewhere, but through practices of efficiency, more structure can be maintained with a smaller input of energy or information. A key thing here is that different beings in the world are capable of different amounts of increasing and decreasing entropy. For example, the first one is living organisms. So, all life is a repository for and a creator of information. The more an organism reproduces and flourishes, the more it decreases local entropy and increases local information. Therefore, it is good for organisms to flourish. The next one is animals. Animals have the ability over plants to gather, process, and autonomously act on information. Remember the 3 souls that Aristotle points out? Well, animals have this extra thing, and so therefore they are better at creating local order than plants are. So therefore it's very good for animals to flourish. What about human beings? Well, human beings have the advantages of being an organism and of being an animal, but they also have the advantage of advanced reasoning, advanced information processing. So they are very extremely capable of increasing local order, and for that reason, human flourishing is even better. It's really, really good. What about the fourth one, communities, societies, and civilization itself. These are, as we mentioned earlier, second order cybernetic entities. And these are able to create more order than the individuals that are comprising them would be able to create on their own. And so, for that reason, the flourishing of communities is very good. Well, the same thing goes for ecosystems, but ecosystems are more like communities of organisms. This, like human communities, allows organisms to come into a natural balance through complex associations. This too creates more order than the individual living things could create on their own. Therefore, the flourishing of ecosystems is good. And lastly, we have information processing machines. These are capable of collecting, storing, and processing information, and therefore they also greatly contribute to increasing local order and therefore decreasing local entropy. Therefore, it is good for information processing machines to flourish. Thus, Bynum concludes the section on Wiener by saying that if we agree that entropy is the greatest natural evil, then a major goal of ethics ought not just to be the flourishing of human beings, but rather the flourishing of all entities in the universe, of plants, of animals, of ecosystems, of just societies, and even of well-behaved cybernetic entities. Furthermore, since all objects in the universe count as informational objects, then this theory gives value to all things in virtue of their existence in spite of entropy. This even applies to rocks, which briefly brings us back to Singer. What Singer didn't see, Bynum would say, is that rocks do have interests in remaining the rocks that they are. By breaking them apart, you are destroying the thing that was holding itself together. And so you ought to have a good reason for doing so. This leads us to the last philosopher that Bynum covers in this essay, Luciano Floridi. Now, he's one of the bigger figures today in this field, and he's still publishing papers. So if you are interested, you can look up his work. So Floridi developed his own theory called information ethics, which focuses on objects as information rather than as negative entropy, the way that Bynum himself does. All objects in the universe are informational clusters, and therefore require some minimal respect as information. Moreover, all objects can therefore be agents, either creating, destroying, or exchanging information with other things in the universe. Even a rock communicates information through its collisions and its obstinates. Floridi calls the total set of all objects that are informational objects the infosphere. And the goal of his ethics is to promote flourishing of the infosphere as a whole. Good, then, is what improves the infosphere, and bad is what harms the infosphere. Floridi appeals to a famous philosopher, Baruch Spinoza, for one of his central axioms. And that axiom is, existence is good. From this statement, Floridi is able to conclude that all things must have a right, to some degree, to exist. With this, Bynum thinks that Floridi's philosophy, which does count as a fully fledged general flourishing ethics, can resolve the third and final anomaly, which I just deleted. But anomaly 3, if we recall, is difficulty coping with non-human agents. This is resolved by general flourishing ethics, as all entities are taken to be equal in terms of their possible moral worth and moral agency. Non-human entities are thus just as analyzable as human ones. Bynum goes on to explain that he has very high hopes for this theory, which, I must admit, I do too. This theory, which I prefer to call ontocentrism, seems to show quite a lot of promise in solving the problems that we are going to have tomorrow with AIs and with the environment. My work actually centers around it, so I am invested, I will admit, but I do not wish to overly influence you in regards to it. Rather, I feel that showing you this acts as a nice conclusion to our introductory philosophy class. We have roughly proceeded in chronological order through this lecture series, and so it makes sense that the last lecture would touch on something that is very recent and very still under development. I hope that this class has at least taught you a thing or two about philosophy and how it affects the world that we live in, and what sorts of ideas have been created in the past that perhaps you believed all along but never knew where they came from. In any case, that concludes this lecture series. I encourage you all to keep reading and to keep asking questions. With that, that's all, folks.